Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. My guest today is Duncan Reyburn, a professor at the University of Pretoria and a scholar whose work focuses on the thought of G.K. Chesterton and Rene Girard. Thanks for doing this.
It is such a joy to be able to chat to you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's nice. I've followed you on Twitter for quite a while and been interested in the things that you post there. So it's nice to see you face to face.
It is indeed. It's lovely.
Has Twitter been a good experience for you all overall?
Overall, I would say it's been unbelievably positive. Obviously, there occasionally you meet the odd sort of hostile person on there, but mostly I've met fascinating people. I've gotten to have really interesting conversations. Most people are, I think, quite warm and open if you take the time to get to know them. But yeah, of course, there are exceptions to that.
Wait until you have a tweet that goes really viral and you get, say, in excess of 50,000 or to 100,000 views or more. Then that's when you meet the crazies.
Yeah, I have had a few viral tweets, and what I've done with those is I've mostly just muted them and then not paid any attention to the comments. And I also think it really does help my experience to have a fairly heavy filter on notifications.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't doubt that the crazies are out there, but my sort of mutuals and those who are sort of my regular interactions are really fantastic.
Right. Yeah. I think people who are not heavy Twitter users probably don't understand what a positive experience it can be. Now, we talked about before we started that we wanted to talk about Rene Girard a little bit. Why don't you give us a quick rundown on who Rene Girard was and what he stands for?
He is there's I suppose you could get a lot of the Wikipedia version of Rene Girard, and so everyone can go and have a look at that. But the very rough picture is that he was a French intellectual who spent most of his academic life and career in America teaching there. He started out as a literary scholar, and from his studies of literature started to develop some really remarkable insights around human desire. And his major insight, which sort of goes against the modern mainstream of thinking, was that desire is not a fundamentally autonomous phenomenon. It is something that is interpersonal, sometimes even, I guess you could say, transpersonal. There is something about desire that it emerges within human interactions rather as something that spontaneously arises within specific subjects. And so he took that insight into all kinds of territory. So you'll hear him described as various things. He's described as a philosopher, as an anthropologist, but he was really a literary scholar. And that's that's what got him going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He was a 20th century thinker.
He was. He passed away in 2015. Incidentally, one of the few times I've visited America, he died while I was there.
No, unrelated. Pure coincidence, I assume.
Yeah, very big coincidence. Just a few miles apparently from where I was. And
right, I'm just teasing you, as if you're visiting was the cause.
No, I caused them to. I caused them to kick the bucket. Yeah.
But how does he differ? Do you think? Maybe this is too expansive a question, but how do you think he differs from the other most famous French intellectuals of the 20th century?
That is a great question. He actually has a comment about that in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which is this book it's a really great interview style book. And he bashes his fellow Frenchies, people like Derrida and Lacan and a few others, for being impenetrable. And he said, does it have to be totally confusing before people will understand what you say? And so I think that gets to the essence of Girard. He was a very clear communicator. When you read his writing, he's quite fascinating because you don't really need to read an introductory book to Girard. You can just go and read Girard. He is so straightforward, clear, wonderful communicator, and very witty in his own way. I think, a wonderful writer. Yeah.
What do you think that means? So, many of the worst philosophers I have read are also terrible writers, almost intentionally so, it seems. Okay. So try to
I
read,
think, yeah.
say, Horkheimer and Adorno. Terrible people who write horribly. But at the same time, if you go and you read Kant, for example, he's crystal clear. Now, that doesn't mean he's right, but I always feel like when I read one of these philosophers whose prose is impenetrable, I always feel like they're trying to trick me somehow. Do you get that sense?
I think that is true of some people. I don't. Let's pick the one who's criticized for being almost completely impenetrable is Hegel.
Mm.
And in some sense, Girard is a Hegelian, because he does have a sort of dialectical way of viewing things. But Hegel, I don't think, was trying to confuse people. I think he was really trying to, if I think of his phenomenology of spirit, I really think he was trying to explain very clearly what he meant.
Mhm.
But I suspect it's a problem of overthinking,
Mhm.
and trying to articulate yourself in as precise a way as you can, and then getting sort of carried away with your own thinking. Whereas I think with Girard, he was so aware that he would be read. He wanted to be understood. He wanted an audience for his work. I know from having just read other people who knew him personally, he was a very lovely human being, very just a nice person to be around. And I think that sense of connection he felt with other people definitely comes through in his writing. Whereas a lot of intellectuals have this problem of being impenetrable because I think that they were in themselves kind of alienated from the world. That would be my rough theory. I suppose you would have to look at individual cases to get a clearer picture.
But also, it seems to me that that kind of use of impenetrability has got to be related for the 20th century intellectuals to their hatred of the world as they found it, particularly their revolutionary spirit. So if you read, like I said, Adorno, if you read Foucault, if you read Marcuse, right? These people, they're all impenetrable. And I think it's because they're trying to draw you into a different sort of reality, which they see as undermining the social structures that they hate.
I think that
That's my take.
that's a really great, sort of encapsulated. I think that the posture we have towards the world will inevitably come out in our writing. It's something that's one of Nietzsche's really great insights. Nietzsche, who's also very easy to understand in some sense because he was really, much more emotive, and he sort of tried to express himself. But one of his insights was this idea that philosophy is really unconscious autobiography. That philosophers are inadvertently most of the time writing about themselves and the way they see the world. Then Nietzsche then just did that self-consciously. He was aware that he was presenting himself to the world, somewhat nervously at times, somewhat aggressively, because he had his own struggles. But I think that's something that it comes through. Especially, I see it in Chesterton, who was brilliant. Could have been, if he really wanted to, he could have been a college professor. He could have gone into philosophy, but his posture towards the world was one of human connection, speaking to people, speaking especially to the common man, as he saw sort of ordinary people battling with ordinary things. And as a result of that awareness, that posture, his writing is so alive with just human goodness, the better side of our humanity, I suppose.
And you say Girard is something like that.
I think so. He
Give
had
us
a he had a very, I mean, I think ultimately his work tends towards a kind of pessimism because most of his energies, which we can get to, I guess, eventually move towards describing human beings as prone to sin, violence, sacrificial logic, scapegoating, that kind of thing. So he's quite pessimistic there, but apparently that he, as a person, he was much lighter than what comes across in his writing. But yeah.
So give us the basics. What are the basic concepts we need to know if we're going to understand anything about Rene Girard?
I think so. Obviously, the first concept I've already touched on is his notion of mimetic desire. Desire is mimetic, so it's imitated. He would probably then differentiate between consciously imitated desire, which he would just call imitation, and unconsciously imitated desire. So that's when people tap into others' desires unconsciously, that would be mimetic desire. He would talk very much about how desires can become contagions, which we've had a literal contagion in recent years, which very interestingly, Albert Camus in his novel The Plague actually uses that as a symbol of mimetic desire itself. So Girard would actually argue that mimetic desire is not his invention in any way. It's a discovery that he articulates in a certain way, but many people prior to him have actually noticed, and he would actually then argue that the biblical revelation is that the Bible itself is the best revealer, the apocalypse of mimetic desire. So you can see desire then he would say has a triangular structure. You would have a subject of desire, you would have, let's say that's Eve, you would have the object of desire, well, potential object. The object almost doesn't matter, but that would be the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then you have the model. That would be the serpent or the Satan in this case, who models the desire for the fruit to Eve. And Eve, prior to encountering the serpent, has actually no real interest in the fruit because her desire has been mediated by God to be for all the other trees in paradise. The serpent then comes along and says, no, actually this fruit over here looks really good, doesn't it? And she goes, yes, it does. Especially because it instigates a rivalry with God. And so rivalry is very much part of the play of desire. As soon as our desires are for a single object that is in short supply, maybe it's not just one object, but many, but as soon as there's a shortage of the object of desire, the many hands that reach out for that object turn into closed fists and that's where rivalry starts. So there would be kind of three levels of desiring. There would be the modeling of desire the modeling of mimetic desire. Then there would be the rivalry, and then there would be the obstacle. So that would be where the other, who is also reaching for what you desire, is not just a rival, but is in the way of you achieving what your desire is geared towards. Then they become an obstacle. And so obviously the most dramatic result of that would be murder. But that murder is also very ultimately an inadvertent suicide because human beings are all about mapping the world and trying to create some sort of justice system. And so that murder would turn into a revenge cycle.
All right, I have a question.
Sorry?
I said I have questions before we move on from mimetic desire.
So go for it. That's why we're here.
All right, so here is the problem that I have every time I hear this scheme laid out.
Yeah.
If all of our desires are mimetic, meaning that we just want what we see other people wanting, right? Where did the first desire come from?
So I have exactly that same question about this scheme.
Okay.
And one of the things that I would say, so let me start with a critique of Girard, and then I will go into my theory of it. My critique is that Girard almost begins with empty subjects. So we're not really there until we imitate the desire of the other. And so there's actually no foundation there. I mean, maybe there are ways he gets around this, but it seems to me there's nothing for the copied desire to hook onto. And I'm not a social constructionist by any means. I think that that in many ways the sheer physicality of the world dominates. I think that nature is more powerful than nurture, despite what the social constructivists would say. And so I think that's where the flaw comes in. So desire is always this entirely externalized thing. There's also a tendency to create an artificial, I guess, distinction between need and desire. So Girard would say, no, needs are things like food. You want to eat. Desire comes in as soon as you want to have something specific, like everyone needs water, but not everyone wants to drink Evian. So the branding would be sort of an example of mimetic desire. So I think that there's a problem there with that. And so how I would modify Girard's theory slightly, and I have a book in the works on this, is that desire cannot merely be imitated, it must be mediated, which is slightly more complex than imitation because it suggests that there is already a present sense of a need or desire for something that must emerge somehow and then be taken hold of in relation to the other. And it's also that seems to make more sense to me simply because I think other people, we cannot interpret desires perfectly. Other people desire in a certain way according to who they are, according to the being that they have. So we must naturally interpret the desire according to not just our own being, but the relation between self and other. So I think there's more complexity to it. And maybe that gets closer to an answer to your question than before.
Well, the substance of your critique is essentially the same problem I've always had with this scheme. It seems to me that if we say all of our desires are mimetic, that we are almost in a way denying the reality of the soul, and that the soul has desires from the moment it is born. So at the very least, I think we could say the soul desires the true, the good, and the beautiful at every moment. So I suppose we could take kind of a little bit of a Thomistic approach here and say that the human being is always desiring the good. And so that if the human being has no desires, as you were saying, prior to encountering some imitative process or some envy or what, then it's a denial of the soul in that way, because it is the soul is in a sense almost defined by its ability to desire the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I can't get, and while there may be lots of great things with Rene Girard's approach, I just can't get down with the denial of the fundamental human reality of desire. That and I suppose too that in the theory of mimetic desire, it strikes me as being a quite highly materialistic, in the sense that do we desire the Ferrari because our neighbor has it, or do we desire it because that material object carries some meaning at another level which we're trying to access, whether that's social status, because we believe that it's social status is good, and that kind of thing. So it kind of strips away, it seems to me, a lot of that secondary level of meaning. I had one other thought about it. I don't know. You respond to that. Maybe my thought will come back to me.
So I think what's very interesting is for Girard, and I did sort of hint at this earlier, the object somewhat disappears. It becomes almost irrelevant what the object is. So another key kind of concept in Girard's thinking is the notion that all desire is metaphysical. What he means by that is that he believes we have, and so this is not exactly my belief. Again, I would want to modify this, but he believes that we naturally feel our own ontological lack. We lack being. And so we see in the model of desire a being, a kind of being that is fulfilled. This is not unimaginable if you think of how people relate to celebrity or to, I guess, anyone who has sufficient status or power. People look at those other people and they think, oh, they have so much more. And then they sort of latch on to the semiotics of fulfillment and they go, oh, they are fulfilled because they have the Ferrari or the Porsche or whatever it is. They seem to possess the being that the subject lacks. And I think the truth of that is of course that we are contingent beings. We are partial. We, as you say, from a Thomistic perspective, we desire fullness. We desire God. That's the ultimate sort of fulfillment of all desire is God, and that would be the very much part of the Platonist heritage of philosophical and theological thinking that we're dealing with. And certainly, I think if I were to have had a conversation with Girard, I think he would have on some level gone, yes, that's true. But he was trying to articulate his theory in very materialistic terms. And I think that is, again, this thing of working with an audience, I think that is part of the realm of academia, is that you have to be atheistic, you have to tap into the kind of logic of liberalism to be able to articulate your theory, even though in a very definite and ultimate sense, his work is an apologia for Christianity. He's trying to say, well, this is where the truth is. So it's very interesting. He's playing these two games, and the game he wants to play is the Christian game, but the game he's almost forced to play, which is very interesting from a mimetic perspective, is the evolutionary kind of perspective on desire. I doubt that covers everything that you were saying, but that's sort of maybe some stuff to factor in.
I recalled the third thing I wanted to say. It seems to me that a large part of the Christian tradition for human development actually emphasizes the renunciation of desire for worldly realities. And well, I suppose it's really the renunciation of exactly what you were describing there. It's the Christian tradition prescribes the renunciation of the belief that fulfilled desire for anything other than God could make up for our ontological lack. Maybe I didn't say that very clearly, right? But the Christian tradition tells you there's nothing in the world you could want that would fulfill you. That's more clear, okay?
Yes.
And so I wonder what Girard would say if confronted with this idea that our ultimate and final desire is for the being of God. How is that mimetic? Right? How is the desire for union, individual union in love with the creator of our being? How is that mimetic?
Yeah, so that is a good question. Well, obviously, right in the smack bang in the middle of all the scriptures is this idea of the imitation of Christ. I think of Paul's commandment, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so who was Christ imitating? Well, obviously, he wasn't imitating anyone. But Girard says at some point, I can't tell you where exactly in his writings, but he mentions this idea that Christ never claimed to have any being. And in fact, he comes along with this thing of denying self. I guess you would have to then ask all sorts of questions about what is that self that is being denied. But I think there's a tricky thing in Christianity, which is this thing that Jesus is perfect. He doesn't have to deny anything really, because he's not giving up false desires. He manifests pure perfection at every step. And so he doesn't cling, I guess, to any self that would be created out of mimetic desire. But that would suggest that there is a foundational being that does not lack in the way that the rest of us feel. So he is not imitating anyone. He is just fully himself,
And
as
that,
the manifest second person of the Trinity, basically.
sure. I mean, he says this over and over. He says, I only do what I see the Father doing. My Father and I are united in our will, right? And this is the reason that Gethsemane is a big deal, because the dramatic question is whether the union of will between the Father and the Son will be severed, right? So all of that leads me to a new understanding of what we might think of as the true self and the false self. And maybe if we're willing to admit that concept, perhaps what we could say is that Girard is kind of elucidating for us at least one of the processes by which the false self is developed, which is we enter into the world and we develop a false sort of identity based on this kind of mimetic process in which we desire what other people desire and they desire what we desire, and we get caught in the world in that way, and we develop a sense of ourselves based on this essentially shifting sand. We build our house on the sand in a way.
Yeah, I think there is a truth in the fact that there is a certain kind of insecurity that people are capable of that does make them unusually prone to specifically envy, that thing you mentioned, which is actually at the root of Girard's thinking. He would say that it's pride and envy that go before the fall and not just pride. And I've certainly seen this at play. And very interestingly, one of the reasons I found Girard so fascinating is because my experience has not been Girard said he looked at the world and he realized he was full of envy. He wanted to be someone else, basically. That hasn't been my experience. I am not a very mimetic being in many ways. I tend to go not for any rivalrous reasons against the flow. I've got my own sense of what my mission is, which doesn't necessarily align with the world I'm in, even in academia, which is all kinds of chaos. But I definitely have witnessed this phenomenon, and certainly it's in me as well. Like there have been moments where I go, "Oh, that's that little thing there. That's definitely envy, and that needs to not have a say." But I think that's what the renunciation is. That's the false self that needs to be renounced to claim some sense of true identity. I would almost say it's helpful to think of almost Plato's ladder, the famous sort of this desire for the ultimate, which is manifest in the lowest part of ourselves, the erotics of being, to use William Desmond's notions. But as we climb the ladder of desire, we get closer to the agapeics, the fullness of what desire is supposed to be. And then those lower things are not thrown away, they are just reordered. And I think that is ultimately the goal, is to have a well-ordered house, to have desire set in its right place.
Mhm.
And that is definitely not. And William Desmond, another philosopher who I really like, he would say, the thing that desires is never just mere lack. Otherwise, what is doing the desiring? There has to be some sort of thing that is a foundation for all of this, all of our human experiences.
Mhm. Right, because there has to be something that experiences a lack, right? But also it's also interesting because if we can experience lack, it seems to me we must have some intuitive notion of fullness. We must be able to say, I lack this.
Yeah,
And and lack is defined as our having some notion of almost like what it would mean to be in an ideal situation. So we have this like inner knowledge of the ideal. We have to if we have a sense of lack.
absolutely. It needs to be some sort of foundational good sense of the good.
Mhm.
And that also points to the fact that it's one of the critiques of Girard's work, which I think it it's ultimately not correct, but it does point to a potential flaw in the way he's articulated it, which is that doesn't he just ontologize evil? The minute you end up with this plummeting always into sort of contagion and into what he calls undifferentiation, a mimetic crisis that gives rise to scapegoating, that all of that process that feels so inevitable when you read his work, that it becomes very difficult to believe that positive reciprocity is a possibility. Why do we also share in good communities? Why do we laugh? Why all of those things? I mean, those are part of the human experience too. And I think those you can only articulate properly in terms of a robust metaphysics, I guess, of fullness.
Mhm. Let's talk.
Which
Go ahead.
yeah, I've written two pieces on that idea of trying to get into positive reciprocity, which I think where we should be heading, obviously.
Tell me about Girard and scapegoating and all of that before we finish up.
So Girard kind of looks at a bunch of archaic texts, myths, and even anthropological studies, and he notices that this pattern always emerges where there is chaos. Sometimes that is in myth and legend that comes out as a flood. It's quite a good metaphor for the chaos. Obviously, if you think of Tiamat in the Mesopotamian story, linked with water and turbulence, there's this chaos. And then what is happening in that chaos is people find themselves in a state of undifferentiation, meaning that they don't know whose desires to imitate. We're seeing that play out very much on the internet with the fact that people are so caught up in, I guess, a realm of trivial choices that it becomes very unclear what desires are worth imitating. Because I do think that is foundationally true, that we will emulate the desires of others in some form or another. And so what happens in that state of undifferentiation is people are constantly trying to differentiate themselves. And the way that they inevitably come up with to do that more properly is to scapegoat. When you don't have a clear sense of an aim or a direction, the easiest way to differentiate is to create an enemy.
Mm.
America, the polarization in America around left and right is a classic example of this, where both sides are basically trying to found their identity on mutually scapegoating the other team. which I've heard can get very messy when families not even willing to sit around the same
Sure.
Thanksgiving table, that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that they've got an identity. The reason why we have identity politics is because identity is an issue. It's not something that people know anything about. So this scapegoating violence, often it can be sort of polarization in terms of teams. What's happening there is they're just imitating the other team's desire to hate the other team. And that escalates, and then an actual scapegoat will usually be chosen. That seems to be happening. I've noticed just the discourse at the moment around anti-Semitism has gotten really hot. There's a new anti-Semitism that's coming up. Inevitably, it's not about justice, although people will in their heads think this is what's happening, this is all about justice. They'll pick some group, some individual sometimes to scapegoat. That person or group will be murdered either symbolically through canceling or literally. And I think there are cases of that. And if it works, which it doesn't in the modern world, which is very interesting and for various reasons, if it works, people tend to want to find a way to repeat that. And that is, from an anthropological perspective, how myths and rituals get born as ways to solidify a certain form of scapegoating. The gospel story is an inversion of the myth because it reveals the scapegoating mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is clearly innocent, and he is clearly scapegoated. And you can even see in the gospel narratives how the different sides actually team up. You see I guess the Judaic, maybe better, leadership teaming up with Rome,
Right.
because they're glad they have a scapegoat. But it's very unusual. Usually people go, no, the person who was scapegoated was guilty.
They deserved it.
They deserved it. In the Christian story, it was arbitrary, which is, of course, closer to the actual truth. So that would be, again, very rough sketch, but that kind of tells you where Girard is going.
Yes. So this is why you say his work is ultimately a form of Christian apologetics.
Yes.
He's trying to explain Jesus in some way.
And he basically arrives with, we have to renounce our violence. We have to renounce our claim to have an identity in some sense, so that we do not cause the world to totally disintegrate and splinter, especially because the Christian revelation functions as a kind of virus in a way, because it filters into everything. And so the scapegoating mechanism doesn't work. And that means that people will be constantly then in a process of creating more and more violence to try and relieve themselves of violence. That's what Girard interprets the scripture about Satan driving out Satan, is basically the fact that people tend to use violence to try and drive out violence, but that never works. So we need to renounce that and, I guess, end up in some form of pacifism, which is a very interesting discussion on its own.
What are the implications of all these ideas, you think? Do people take them seriously? Do they have any power in the contemporary world? Are people trying to apply Girard's ideas somehow?
Yeah, so I think one of let's say the positive side is that Girard's theory functions very often as a kind of hermeneutic. It's a frame you can look through and you can see it play out. And it's almost impossible once you've read Girard not to see these various aspects and stages and fluctuations of mimetic desire at play. It's so brutally obvious. The negative side is that it can become a little bit like a trap, which Girard himself, even he's got this really great discussion on Nietzsche's parable of the madman on the death of God, where Girard goes, oh, I'm so tired of finding scapegoating everywhere. Let me read something where where God dies a natural death. That's how he kind of takes it. And he starts reading Nietzsche's parable, whatever, and
Summarize
ends
that for
up
people who don't know. What is the parable of Abbott?
the madman arrives in the street and says, God is dead, God is dead. And the atheists around him go, what are you talking about? There is no God. And Nietzsche says it's very interesting on its own, where he goes, well, that form of atheism is the stupid version. The clever form is where we acknowledge that God is not non-existent, but dead. But then Nietzsche straight after that goes, and we have killed him. And so Nietzsche is basically then describing the fact that religion, and he describes church as sepulchres, so he says religion is ultimately a death cult. It's always built around the scapegoat, which is true of ancient religion, and in a certain sense, but obviously inverted, is true of Christianity, where the death of God is exactly the reason for the religion. I know the word religion.
When you say it's inverted, what do you mean?
What I mean is that Christianity doesn't celebrate the murdering, like if you the Dionysian rites, you've got Dionysius is torn to pieces, and this is a good thing, because it's through this that we can actually celebrate the forming of the religion. Whereas in Christianity, we mourn the fact that this happened. We mourn the fact that, in a very real sense, we very likely would have been part of the crowd that killed him. That's sort of the acknowledgement there. But then there is also the celebration of the resurrection of Christ as true God, and not merely as artificially elected as true God. Because what usually happens is, in ancient religion, is you do have a sort of deification of the victim. But it celebrates the victimization, whereas Christianity undermines it. So that's what I mean by, I guess, inverted. Maybe it's not the right term, but that would be the rough idea.
So where's Girard going from here? Girardian studies. You're saying people are using it as a window through which to look.
Yeah, and I think one of the Girardian scholars put it well. He said it should be like, this is James Allison, I think. He said it should be like Saint Therese Lisieux's Little Way. It should not be a sort of, I guess, the size of the picture can be, you can get kind of overwhelmed by, oh, these are the patterns, these are the things that are going on. Whereas even reading Girard, you realize the real strength of him as a writer, as a critic, as just a very perceptive person, was his attention to detail, to the way that certain stories are much more nuanced than the sort of the big picture would suggest. So where Girardian studies are going in all directions. So you've got the sciences where they're actually proving this using neuroscience and the study of mirror neurons. You have psychological studies where they're looking at people in rooms and they're trying to see, does scapegoating actually happen in a situation like this? The answer is yes. So it's demonstrable. It's not merely theoretical. Then you have people like me my contributions to Girardian studies are mainly on the side of positive reciprocity. And I have a humor theory, which people can have a look at, where I explain humor using Girard's theory. I suggest that humor results from a gentle, kindly scandal. So where there's a bit of rivalry, like the rivalry between two friends in a race, where there's actually love and appreciation as the foundation, but there's a little bit of trying to outcompete each other. Humor has a structure similar to that. But there's people looking at creativity. It's hugely applicable to so many dimensions of life. It's very exciting.
Where should a person who wants to read Girard start?
That is a great question. I started with Violence and the Sacred, but I suspect most people would not want to go there. I think his most accessible book is I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. it's a wonderful book, and I really would recommend that people start there. Luke Burgess has a great book called Wanting, where he uses more sort of everyday language to explain Girard's theory. But
Luke Burgess, who I've spoken to maybe on this podcast later in the year. So maybe maybe we can find more from him.
Yeah, he's really great. It's so funny. He just tweeted today that he doesn't really want to talk about his book, which I do understand. I think once you've written a book, you go, I've said my bit. But his book is it's been well received, and it's good work. He knows his stuff.
Is Girard. Well, thank you very much. You're on Twitter. Are you anywhere else online where could people read your things?
So I have a Substack. So Duncan Reyburn, Reyburn at .substack.com is where I post my main interest at the moment is interpreting the signs of our time. I have a book on Chesterton called Seeing Things as They Are, which is it's heady scholarly stuff. And I've got another scholarly book on Chesterton coming out probably next year called The Roots of the World and the Remarkable Prescience of G.K. Chesterton, where I look at Chesterton's prescience, his forecasting of the future, and how he did
Let's get together again and talk about this.
We'll do that. It's been really great to chat. Thank you. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and we'll talk soon.